Faith, for me, is an intensely personal experience. And clearly there are many responses to that question. But all I can do is tell you mine. The first time I went to Auschwitz, I was simply overwhelmed. I stood in Auschwitz-Birkenau on the train tracks that brought Jews from all over Europe to be gassed, burned, and turned to ash. The Nazis actually endangered their own war effort in order to divert trains to this relentless evil for evil's sake. I went through Stammlager Auschwitz, seeing the suitcases, the spectacles, the glasses, the hair. The Nazis kept everything. Everything was worth keeping except one thing: human life. I could not believe that. They kept the suitcases and they killed 1.25 million people, 250,000 children. And then I saw the photographs, because in Auschwitz, for the first people who were sent to Auschwitz, they took photographs of them. Of course, they stopped that quite soon. But there were photographs of 4-, 5-, 6-year-old children. I just broke down, I wept. And I asked myself, God, where were you? And words came into my mind. I'm not claiming they were any kind of revelation. And this is what they said. I was in the words, you shall not murder. I was in the words, you shall not oppress a stranger. I was in the words that were said to Cain when he killed Abel, the first murder in the Bible. Your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And suddenly I knew that when God speaks and human beings refuse to listen, even God, as it were, is helpless. He knew that Cain was about to kill Abel, but he didn't stop him. He knew Pharaoh was about to kill Israelite children. He didn't stop him. God gives us freedom and never takes it back, but he tells us how to use that freedom. And when human beings refuse to listen, even God is powerless. And then there was the second answer that came to me from Holocaust survivors, many of whom told me they felt that God was personally with them, giving them the strength and courage to survive. There were people who lost their faith at Auschwitz. There were people who kept their faith. And there were people who found faith in Auschwitz. To my mind, one of the most moving stories is the one Viktor Frankl told about himself. When he first came to Auschwitz, they stripped him of everything, of his clothes, his identity, the one thing that was most precious to him, apart from his wife and family, which was the book he'd written. He said that when they took that from me, my life was over. And of course they took their clothes and they took them all into a shower, and he was expecting that to be death. But he was one of the lucky ones. It was just a shower. And afterwards they gave him clothes of people who'd been killed. And he put on these clothes and he felt in one of the pockets, and there was something in one of the pockets. And he took it out, a scrap of paper, and it had been torn from a siddur, from a prayer book. And it contained these words, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And he said, those words transfixed me. They suddenly were saying to me, now you must live every single thing you ever taught and practiced. You must live that here in Auschwitz. And that gave him the courage to do what he did, which was give people the will to live. So that is where God was, in the commands, in the sanctity of life that were so cruelly and devastatingly unheard. and in the hearts of some of the survivors who found God, giving them the strength. Speaking personally, the most profound Jewish response to the Holocaust I know is Sefer Echa, the Book of Lamentations. The book written after the destruction of the first temple. The poetry of lament, bitter lament, lament unto death. It is one of the most searing pieces of literature ever written. And we said it in memory of the loss of the first and second temples, on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, on the saddest day of the Jewish year. I know of no more profound theological response. In Judaism, the most profound theological response is not an answer. It's not a theology. It's a cry. I heard of a rabbi who went through the Holocaust, this is a true story, and lost his wife and all 11 children, and was asked afterwards, "Do you have no questions of God?" And he replied, "Of course I have questions of God. My questions of God are so powerful that were I to ask them, God himself would invite me up to heaven to give me the answers. And I prefer to be down here on earth with the questions than up there in heaven with the answers." Now, that sounds clever, but actually it's very profound. I have said many times, faith is not certainty. Faith is the courage to live with uncertainty. And after the Holocaust, uncertainty is where we live. Our response to the Holocaust involves justice, absolutely. But justice is universal, and it's a phenomenon of every crime. It has nothing specifically to do with the Holocaust. What interests me is something quite different, and that is what I call Tikkun. Tikkun is a Jewish mystical concept developed by Isaac Luria in the 16th century, which speaks about mending the tears in the fabric of creation. And in the case of the Holocaust, three individuals speak to me very, very much. Number one was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, whom I knew. He was the first Jew ever, really, to engage in outreach, to reach out to Jews who had been distant from the tradition in the most remote places. He did this all over the world. He never explained why. I mean, why had it never been done before? Why was he the first to do it? And of course, it would have changed every Jewish community in the world. And I once suggested this: he had lived through the Holocaust. And he had seen hate for hatred's sake. And he was a mystic, and he did believe in Tikkun. And therefore I believe that what he was doing is reaching out to every Jew in love, as once the Nazis searched out every Jew in hate. That was his Tikkun. And as I say, it changed the whole tenor of the Jewish world. The second was an extraordinary story which I was unaware of until the London Olympics of 2012. And it was then the BBC showed a very moving film about somebody I'd never heard of before, Dr. Ludwig Guttmann. Dr. Guttmann was in 1933 the leading neurosurgeon in Germany. But in 1933, Jews were removed from all the professions. He was thrown out of the hospital. He was able to work for the next 5 years in a Jewish hospital, but then in 1938 it just became too dangerous for him, and he left and he came to London. Realizing the genius they had in their midst, the British government asked him in 1944 to set up the first ever dedicated unit for the treatment of paraplegics, which he did. And he was horrified by what he saw, because these paraplegics, all suffering war injuries, were young people, 20, 21 years old, and their life expectancy was between 3 and 6 months. They were being kept heavily sedated, horizontal in hospital beds. And he realized there was no need for this. These were young men who had a life in front of them. And he set about giving them new life. And it was very difficult. The first thing he did was reduce their sedation, their painkillers, which hurt. Then he started throwing balls at them so they would catch them, and that hurt. And then he got them out of their beds into wheelchairs, and that hurt. And the doctors accused him of cruelty. And he took him to a tribunal. And one of his fellow doctors said, "Who do you think these men are? They are moribund cripples." And he said, "Who do I think they are? The best of men." Eventually, he got them out into the garden, playing games, and he put the doctors and nurses into wheelchairs. And the paraplegics, because they were used to wheelchairs, beat the doctors. And he gave them, for the first time, a sign of life. So he began to organize more competitions, and then not just national, but international. And then he started, I think it was 1948, a parallel Olympics. And of course, by the time 2012 came along, they were there from 140 different countries, 4,000 of them, and the whole attitude of the world to them and them to themselves had changed. And I wondered, what was it about a Jewish doctor that took a Jewish doctor from Germany to see what nobody in Britain could see? And then I realized it's obvious, because he was a man the Germans regarded as subhuman, vermin, lice. And he knew he wasn't subhuman. And he looked at these paraplegics and realized they weren't subhuman either. And that was his taking his pain to cure the pain of others, and give them new hope and new life. That was a tikkun. And finally, I think of the Klausenberger Rav, the rabbi of Klausenberg, who lost all his family in the Holocaust, and vowed that if he survived, having seen a whole culture of death, he would do what he could to save life. And he built the Laniado Hospital in Netanya, dedicated to curing people of all religions and all races, and bringing life where once was death. Those are the real responses to the Holocaust. And I find them very moving. How did the Holocaust affect my personal faith? Well, firstly, it hugely strengthened my Jewish identity, because I just felt the weight of all these ghosts. And I knew that what they died for, I had to live for. I could not let their Jewish story end with me. I just couldn't. But it did completely transform my understanding of faith. And here I want to speak about a midrash, a rabbinic exegesis, which dates from 4th, 5th century. And it's commentary on Abraham leaving his land, his home, his father's house. And the midrash was very enigmatic, says the following. What was the matter like? It was like a traveler who is going through a desert and sees a palace in flames. And he says, is it possible that the palace has no owner? Just then, the owner of the palace appeared over the parapet and said, I am the owner of the palace. Now, that's a very enigmatic midrash. But once I had been to Auschwitz, I really understood what it meant. And it is a rather dramatic thing. Abraham saw the universe. It's a palace. This vast universe this vast law-abiding universe, the laws of chemistry, physics, you name it. It's a universe that is pretty predictable for the most part, and it obeys its laws. It's a palace. Somebody made it. It has design. But it's in flames. I see a world full of violence, war, injustice, exploitation, cruelty. Now, somebody builds a palace, doesn't leave it to the flames. You try and put the flames out. So how can I understand that on the one hand, the universe is a palace, and on the other hand, people are ruining it and killing one another? And that's when God appears to Abraham and says, I'm the owner of the palace. I need you to help me put out the flames. I need you to help me put out the flames. God, who made the entire universe, can't put out the flames of violence and injustice? Yes, there is only one thing God cannot do without help from us, and that is live within the human heart. And that is what God was calling on Abraham to do. I need you to help me put out the flames, because I cannot do it myself without destroying this very thing I created, the only thing I created in my image, human beings with freedom of will. I can't take that away without taking everything human away. I would turn humanity into a bunch of 7 billion robots programmed to sing my praises all day long. I'm sorry, that's not what I created in human beings. And I suddenly realized that that is what makes Jewish faith very unusual. Most faith is born in a simple, consistent view of the universe. Judaism is born in cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, we believe in a God of justice. On the other hand, we see a world full of injustice. And it was not the people at the fringes, the disbelievers, the atheists, who raised this challenge. It was the heroes of faith themselves. Abraham said, "Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice?" Moses said, "Why have you done evil to this people?" Jeremiah said, "You always win when I argue with you about justice, but still I want to know, why do the wicked prosper?" Job is an entire book dedicated to it. But when you find that cognitive dissonance between the world that is and the world that ought to be, there's only one way of solving it. And that's not by thought, it's by deed. You have to help God put out the flames. And that is, to me, what faith is all about. I suddenly realized faith is not some passive thing that happens to you. It's an active thing that gets you to engage in the world and fight injustice and ignorance and disease and poverty, because that is what God is asking us for. We have to act. Faith is something we do, not just something we believe. The connection between the state of Israel and the Holocaust is a subtle and delicate one, and we have to distinguish certain things. Number one, the state of Israel does not owe its existence to the Holocaust. That is extremely important. The connection between Jews and the land of Israel goes all the way back, goes back longer than any other connection between a people and a land in the entire West. It goes back to Abraham 38 centuries ago. It goes back to Moses 32 centuries ago. It goes back to King David 30 centuries ago. Israel was the land where our people was born, where David built the temple, where the land, the language, the landscape, all of these are written in the Bible, in the book of Psalms. Going to Israel is coming home. Even the modern state of Israel long antedates the Holocaust. It owes its existence to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, ratified by the League of Nations in 1922. So the Holocaust was not used as an excuse to create the State of Israel. The State of Israel had already been created long before then. And Israel remains the only country. The Jews are the only people ever to have built a nation state in that land. At all other times, it was an administrative district of an empire, and there were many empires. But Jews are the only people who have ever built a nation state there, and our whole history is saturated with it. Secondly, however, there is a fundamental connection between Israel and the Holocaust, and this goes back to July 1938 and the French spa town of Evian. As a result of that conference, not one of the 32 countries opened their doors to any Jews. Not one. And that includes Britain, America, Canada, Australia. Not one. And it was at that moment that Jews knew that there was not 1 square foot of the entire surface of the earth that they could call home in the sense given by the poet Robert Frost as the place where if you have to go there, they have to let you in. After the Holocaust, Jews cannot be without a home. They simply cannot be without a home. It would be the humanitarian disaster of all times. It would be the end of humanity, to be honest with you, especially since anti-Semitism has returned to the world and has returned to Europe. So, Israel, Jews must have a home. And having said that, Palestinians must also have a home. These are not mutually exclusive things at all. And we hope and pray that a way will be found to do just that. And the third sense is quite simply this. During the Holocaust, the Jewish people came eyeball to eyeball with the angel of death. 3 years after the war was over, in proclaiming the state of Israel, the Jewish people said collectively, in the words of the psalm, I will not die, but I will live and give testimony to the God of life. Israel represents the greatest affirmation of life of the Jewish people in the last 2,000 years. What happened, or rather what failed to happen at Evian, convinced Hitler that whatever he did to the Jews, though the world might protest, they would do nothing about it. And that gave him the green light to go ahead. I don't think it was anyone's intention to give him the green light, but that is what he drew from it. Had Jews had the slightest ability to fight for themselves, had they had a home, however small, then he would not have done such a thing. Israel has changed the situation of every Jew in the world because we know there is somewhere we can go and there are people who will fight for us. So had Israel existed then, yes, history would have been very different. In the most uncanny evocation of the Holocaust, Ezekiel the prophet, 26 centuries ago, saw the Jewish people as a valley of dry bones. And God says to Ezekiel, the people say our hope is lost. And he says, but it is not lost, because I am going to take them out of their graves and bring them to the land of Israel. So I see 3 signs of hope today, and they're remarkable. Number 1, the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. We have come back to the state of Israel. And Israel has, in very difficult circumstances, political and military, nonetheless achieved great things in the arts and science, technology and human dignity, extraordinary things. So, number 1, I see the recovery of Jewish sovereignty over the land of our beginnings after an absence of 2,000 years. It's an extraordinary sign of hope, unbelievable sign of hope. Number 2, there has been a complete renaissance of Jewish life, of Jewish learning. We recently had the conclusion of a Talmudic study cycle, which involves studying for an hour or two every single day for 7.5 years. I mean, almost nobody could do that a few generations ago. But today, they were there in their thousands. One little celebration in New York, 90,000 people came together in a baseball stadium, all of whom had done this. Thousands of women came together in Jerusalem to celebrate their completion. Never happened before that so many women completed study of the Talmud. So you see a renaissance of Jewish life that could not have been predicted. You know, they tell of Leopold Zunz, the 19th century German Jewish scholar who believed that you could have an accurate history of Jewish culture because it was now dead and could be studied as a museum artifact. And he once met somebody who told him he was a Jewish poet, and Zunz said to him, "Oh, really? Tell me, when did you live?" So, you know, they regarded that as dead. Today, it's vibrant. And thirdly, the Jewish people. You know, in August, 8th of August 2019, a lady celebrated a birthday. Her name was Shoshana Ovitz. She was 104 years old. She was a survivor of Auschwitz. She asked her eldest granddaughter, "Please, could you compile a list of the names of all my grandchildren and great-grandchildren because I want to pray for them all on my birthday." Unbeknown to her, they decided they would all come together and be with her for her 104th birthday and pray together with her at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. They were photographed together. There were 400 of them. One woman's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. If ever there was a triumph of life over death, I don't know. I can't think of a better example. So you have Israel, you have Judaism, you have the Jewish people, all three of them stronger than they ever were before. And I don't need any more grounds for hope than that. Our hope is not destroyed.